Hi, I'm Taryn Grom, editor and co-founder of Pharma Voice, and welcome to the second episode of the Real Chemistry Think Tanks. I'm here with Joshua Prabhakar and Joanne Saitta, and we're going to discuss how creating a holistic engagement model is improving the customer experience for rare disease patients engaging with a new brand that has launched to the market during COVID. Joanne, I know that you and your team have worked with Joshua and his team during these unprecedented times. And I know you have a little bit of, you want to ask him a couple of questions. So why don't you go to it?
Thanks, Taryn. Yeah, I have to say, I thought of Joshua and I thought of Sobi and the challenges that they've overcome in launching a drug during COVID. It's a monumental exercise, as we all know, to do outside of COVID, having lots of different levers to choose from. But within COVID, having such restrictions on how we could communicate and really bringing a drug to launch for the first time in a hybrid environment is incredibly impressive. And so our teams have worked on that. And Joshua, what might be a couple of the key things that you needed to keep in mind during COVID in order to ensure that customer experience was delivered during the brand launch?
Yeah, so Joanne, great question. And as with many others who are probably in the same boat as us, we had to kind of reevaluate and rethink some of the things we were doing as we were launching in COVID. If I was to underscore a couple things, I think the first is the way the customer engages fundamentally shifted. And so, when we're thinking about personal engagement and that being your primary lever that you were going to pull, the kind of materials and messages that you could put out had to fundamentally shift. So we actually updated our creative completely to be much more focused on a non-personal or omni-channel type focus, but more on the erring on the side of digital. We're moving towards digital. So that was the first thing, just on the creative. The second is just impact of the messages need to be crisp, clear, succinct, knowing that they were not going to be delivered by an individual, but mostly about getting engagement. So, what's the first thing that people are going to engage with that they would find relevant and impactful? And then if they needed to dig in, they could. So I think, we had to fundamentally just shift how people were going to interact with the content. And then lastly, it was about challenging ourselves to think about how do we interface or engage and make sure all the channels are working together, so non-personal and personal together. And so, we stood up in record time a very omni-channel experience. So in 4 months, basically, we had no non-personal to having a fully integrated digital arm standing up. So it was really, really exciting, obviously, with the help of your team. They did yeoman's work to get all that stood up. So that's what I would say is those three things. So impact, knowing how customers are engaging with it, and then we had to stand up channels at record speed.
Joshua, those are good points. Oh, I'm sorry, Joanne.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Joanne, I'll pose the same question back to you then. How did your teams have to react when they did not have access to their normal levers of influence?
Yeah, so agile is the first word that comes to mind, is really being able to pivot and shift and be agile in responding to, a primarily digital communication. I totally concur with Josh's comments around his comments on content. So this content first, this design first thinking is really at the center of omnichannel experiences, and then understanding the customer that we are talking to with that content. So out of the content and out of the design first thinking come the messaging, and then tailored to the channel. I think what our teams have been able to do is phenomenal, as Joshua talked about, and it's really put Sobi and the brand in a position to continually learn and evolve. And to Joshua's point, be successful in delivering those relevant messages, whether it's to the HCP or to patients.
Excellent. And we're talking about a rare disease drug, which already has inherent challenges to begin with. So how do you take those challenges and turn them into opportunities for marketing rare disease drugs? Joshua?
Yeah, I think that's a broad question, right? So around like, we took it as an opportunity not only on rare disease, but just in general, fundamentally reevaluating what the advantages are as we go through COVID, and what the advantages are of having a more omni-channel presence. So specific to your question on rare disease, I think you could go much broader and be much more effective, because the challenge in personal promotion with rare disease is always trying to find the patient, deploying the resources appropriately to be able to talk to the right customers to find that patient. Well, knowing that you had more cost-efficient channels to have as outbound, both on the consumer side and on the physician side, it gave us a lot of latitude in keeping our target lists relatively large, so we could actually have a broader funnel at the top. So, in rare disease, I think it actually posed a really good opportunity for us to have a broad net to cast to kind of make sure we're actually capturing patients.
Interesting, and that's a different kind of approach than maybe you would have taken before, I understand.
Right. So, before you'd probably take the traditional channels of, personal promotion first, and we still had that. So I don't want to downplay that, but I mean, we still had that. But I think it gave us the opportunity to keep a larger net, because your costs are different, right? So I mean, if we were talking to 3,000 customers, physician customers versus 6,000, those are very different numbers from a cost standpoint. But we were able to, our target list was 6,000, so that helped. And then from a patient standpoint, I think it was even more exciting, right? So now you're talking about people who are searching. Physicians, may or may not be interested in our particular disease that we were in, but patients certainly were. And so, speaking to patients more impactfully and effectively gave us the option to drive them into physicians' office to have more impactful conversations, empowering conversations where they could actually go out and proactively ask for what they wanted. And so I think I go back to this, not that we wouldn't have done it before, but I think it accelerated a lot of the consumer work that we would have done, because we knew we needed to do a little bit, a few things differently.
Interesting. And Joanne, from your point of view at the company, you all have a pretty good foothold in that rare disease space in terms of expertise. What were some of the things that you found from launching this in the hybrid from the rare disease space?
Sure. I think just building on what Joshua said from a patient perspective, understanding the patient, and it's obviously much harder, that needle in the haystack for the rare disease patient, but using data in a way to build those audiences in a way that were specific to rare disease patients. And by doing that, again, just reiterating a bit of what Joshua talked about, understanding where that patient population could be, tying it back to physicians in that locale, and being able to further accelerate the conversation between the patient and the HCP. I think that the beauty of some of the data that is now available to us allows us to, in a de-identified way, of course, identify and help patients find doctors that can treat them, and have HCPs further accelerate their treatment decisions. So, for example, the use of de-identified medical claims data and AI technologies can really allow us to target in to potential sufferers, and then knowing where those sufferers exist geographically, we then can align communication to that target list, to those physicians in that geography, to be on the lookout, to be sensitive to patients who might be coming through the door with certain symptoms that open them up to the opportunity of being diagnosed more quickly in that rare disease space.
Excellent. And when we talk about that omni-channel experience, it's a little bit different for pharma, and we're starting to see an acceleration in terms of that approach compared with other industries. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from those other industries as we look as a pharma industry to an omni-channel marketing approach? Joanne, I'll kick off with you.
Sure. Our expectations in healthcare have been raised by our most beloved brands, whether it's Disney or Peloton or Netflix. And I think for us, the learning has been the curation and the customization of content, the necessity of that, to be relevant and then delivered, of course, in a timely and expeditious fashion. But that is a push-pull. It's not just a push, but it is allowing that community member, whether it's a patient or a physician, to be part of a bigger brand community and be able to engage and get information on that brand. Again, we have a challenge ahead of us in healthcare. The experiences by those brands really challenge us as marketers to be delivering communications that are hybrid, that are live and digital, that really foster a community around the brand, and we can do that in healthcare. And then lastly, ensure that those communications are relevant and personalized for the customer.
Wonderful. And Joshua, I'm going to push on you a little bit. As a seasoned marketer, can you imagine a time 5-10 years ago where omnichannel was going to be the way you were going to reach out to patients? And how has that changed over the last couple of years in terms of the strategies you employ now?
Yeah, so I think we were always aspiring to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think what our recent experience going through this did is it catalyzed it, to Joanne's point. I think it made us recognize that, we had to do it. This wasn't a nice to do, this was a need to do. And so, in my 10 years ago, going back to your question, or 5 years ago, I think we'd have to do a lot more selling around why we should do digital promotion and those kinds of things. I think this gave us a very clean and clear look at the importance of doing it, and not doing it wasn't an option, right? So I think it just moved the needle very quickly, and it was very similar to many other things that COVID did for us, like work, whether we show up virtually or in person. So I think there's certain instances where there was a need and a recognition that personal promotion was better, and we needed to kind of keep doing that. But then it also uncovered a lot of areas that had been somewhat buried for us to actually start executing on a non-personal or digital level, right? So I think it catalyzed our adoption of it, I guess I would say. That would be one. I think the second thing I would just say is I think we all have probably tried to do this, right? In pharma, we've all kind of at least provided the lip service for it. I think this really allowed us to actually do it. I always say, I think to Joanne's point, I think we all aspire for the larger consumer brands and the experience of that. I think we have to, at least in my experience, take a much more measured approach of what's possible now and then what's possible, in the midterm and long term. And to me, the industry that we should be at least trying to surpass is the finance industry, right? So they do a great job of how they interact with their customers, and they're a highly regulated industry similar to pharma. And so, for me anyway, and the challenge to my teams has always been that, like, we should be able to provide a similar experience to a bank. And I hope we can do better than that, right? But if we can do that, I think that's already moving the needle in pharma. And then I think, to Joanne's point, the real aspiration is to be much more of a community, building a community, making sure we're acting more consumer-centric on things. So I guess those would be my two thoughts: is it moved the needle, it catalyzed it, and then I think it secondly pushed us by looking at other industries that have already done this well, that are regulated, and how do we actually seek to do better than them.
I think that's a great analogy to the finance industry, and pharma is often compared to that. So I think in terms of the regulations and in terms of the privacy, you're spot on. You talked about measurements, and so we can't have a conversation around omnichannel marketing, or marketing for that matter, without talking about how we measure the results and what is the ROI and what are some of the different structures that are needed now to understand what the movement is, how you're moving the needle in a digital world, because it's different than it was before. So Joshua, you want to kick us off there?
Sure. I think, again, Personal promotion has always been where we start. But I also know from an ROI standpoint, that's probably the least impactful just because your cost going in is so high. I think what we've really, with Joanne's team's help is kind of taken some really significant strides to appropriately evaluate attribution across these channels. Now, we haven't put that out there on this particular brand yet, but we're pretty far along on getting there. So, it's not only about how your individual channels are performing, but how they collectively perform. And so then you're getting a much more clear picture on your ROI, not just looking at your sales channel and going, your ROI is not good there. But without them, the other channels won't perform as well. So you're looking at a much more comprehensive view, in my opinion, on how all your channels are performing and are they driving the ROI you need. And then you start having much more intelligent conversations about what the channel mix should be, or even if we're missing channels, right? So like perhaps there's other things we should be doing that we're not currently. So, I think to answer your question, I think it's the data piece is really critically important in just gathering it. I think how we tag those things, how we're able to, determine what's happening and in what sequence, and then the analysis that goes on behind that is not the cool stuff to talk about, but that is the cool stuff to actually help us be able to execute and optimize.
It's the cool stuff that keeps bringing people back. So
Right.
that's important. Joanne, Real Chemistry has a real foothold in that data and analytics area as well. So I can see why why you all working together was so successful. So talk to us about where you see the role of data and analytics playing out in terms of future metrics and understanding how a brand is performing.
Sure. And really dovetailing what Joshua kind of set us up for, it's really at the heart of allowing businesses to make better decisions and allowing them to react more quickly. What's super exciting about like where we are from a, like a tech maturity and a health tech maturity perspective is we have the tools to collect that data that Joshua talked about from multiple channels, to collect it real time or close to real time, to be able to visualize it, and to be able to serve that up to decision makers in marketing, in sales, and allow them to adjust as quickly as possible. And so it really opens us up to that really delivering on ROI, of course, where we're spending our money in the right places that are effective, but allowing marketers the opportunity to make decisions really quickly. Where I see this evolving, with that as a foundation, and again, kudos to Sobi for being one of the leaders in this space, is we really begin to evolve beyond ROI. And I call it beyond return on investment to return on patient experience and patient outcome. And so when we're doing our job right, ultimately, we're affecting the outcomes of patients. And we look to a day to where we can continue to include that in our measurement. And that return on experience is about how do we make things frictionless for a patient to receive care? How do we make things frictionless for HCPs to deliver care? And as marketers and sales folks, we have certain elements that are in our control that can add to that frictionless experience. And so with the foundational elements that Joshua talked about earlier and that we've implemented for Sobi, we have a much more robust way to impact the experience of patients and doctors.
Excellent, and I love that return on experience rather than the return on investment. It really shifts the conversation to being more about the patient overall. And I like that term also, frictionless, and making it so much easier for that patient along their continuum of their healthcare journey. This is a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, but when we talk about omnichannel marketing, what does that mean to you, Joshua? Because it means something different to almost everybody I speak to. And then I'll ask you the same, Joanne. So what does that mean in terms of your brands and your company?
Well, you should probably start with Joanne, so she can probably give you a much smarter answer than I can. But I'll do my best. I mean, to me, frankly, it's we use all those buzzwords, right? And omnichannel, I think, is one of them. But really, it's all about how are we creating a cohesive experience for people so that they get the information they need in a way that's relevant to them. And so, I think we've taken a very monolithic approach in the past in pharma, and I think all we're talking about now is taking a much more um, cohesive look at all the different touch points that they could have as an individual and a person, and making sure that the content is relevant across all those interactions that they would have. So that's what it means to me, is really just taking a holistic look at how we talk to customers.
Excellent. So it's sort of like journey mapping, but on steroids.
Yes.
I like that term.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that term. Yeah, exactly. And the good news is we're saying the same thing. And the possibilities within healthcare really are at our fingertips now. And it's about omnichannel is about how we deliver that consistent, relevant, and hybrid experience to our customer. And for us, it's about thinking about that content first and design first. And you can think about content and design when you really understand the customer and what they need to experience in order for them to have a positive outcome. And if we start with that as the thinking, then really our processes, our content, our channel, our messages become much more streamlined. I'll add one other thing in there as well, Taryn, is I also believe if we can operate that way, we also enhance the way operations runs, and we can enhance our asset approval process. So the possibilities, both on the front end in speaking and talking and engaging with our customers, as well as to the teams that are producing the materials, is really a great opportunity at our fingertips.
Excellent.
If I could just add, Taryn, two things maybe. To Joanne's point, I think, how we're communicating and the content is critically important, but also knowing where people are, right? So, if a physician's opening something up in their office, they're probably not looking for an in-depth, download on content. They're probably just looking at dosing, right? So, how do we serve that content there? But then recognizing that they wanted to know more at that point, and then later on, maybe in the evening or something else, when they're more interested in having a more laid back approach to getting more in depth, right? So I think it's content, but also just recognizing time and place of that and how we're delivering it, I think is critically important. And then to build on that, the second thing I think is, for me anyways, top of mind for our team is just knowing all that information is really, important that we keep the confidentiality and we're showing up correctly, right? So, for us as Pharma, it's always been critically important to do things the right way for our customers and for patients. And, we know all the restrictions that exist in Europe. And I think, as we get into the US, and Joanne was talking about this, we've got a lot of information, but being responsible with it as an industry, I think is going to be critically important. So, what I always try and challenge ourselves with is also, how do we create the best experiences, but then also knowing, what do the next 3 years looking ahead look like from a regulation standpoint? Are we ascertaining that information in ways that we would feel comfortable, not today, but 3 years from today, right? And if we can do those two things, I think it's, I feel comfortable about it, right? But again, I think as marketers, we always try and push the envelope and try and move very quickly. And so sometimes I feel like it's important to also just put that lens of, how would you feel about that, right? And are we doing those things? Are we having responsibility and rigor around that as well?
I love this. So it's content and context, and then putting yourself in the patient's shoes or your physician's shoes, or the whoever the stakeholder is. And that leads me to my last question. So when we're talking about content development and putting it in context, and we're talking about patients as customers, we're talking about physicians as customers, and we're talking about payers as customers. At some point, is there somebody who's a patient, physician, payer, and all one customer, or are we still looking at 3 different segments of customer types?
So I'll jump in there. I do believe that we have 3. We have 3 different customer types. I think there are certainly mega or macro messaging overall that we want to deliver, and maybe that's more from a company corporate perspective. But it all ties together, and or it needs to anyway, from a corporate, from a clinical to commercial. And so I do see the value in understanding those audiences differently, understanding their needs differently, and to Joshua's point, serving up the information they need at the moment that they're making decisions. I think one other thing, and I want to add in, Taryn, and I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't, and that is our keen understanding of underserved populations, diverse, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion. I think that has to be top of mind for all of us as we continue to kind of move us towards omnichannel, to move us towards really living fully in the digital world. And it's something that I take away, and I purposely make sure that I'm thinking about it when I have conversations like this with our clients. And I think, again, in the spirit of making sure we're not being remiss. So to answer your question, yes, I see these audiences as different. I see them getting pulled together from a clinical, corporate, and commercial perspective. And last but not least, let us all be thinking about the different populations that we need to serve, and the kinds of messaging that they need as well.
Excellent point. Thank you. And I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. It is critically important, more so than ever. So Joshua, we'll give you the last word then.
Yeah, so to answer your question, absolutely. I do think it's three different, and maybe even more, depending on which category you're in. Sometimes advocacy is a very different policy, sometimes sits separately. But anyway, I think there are distinct customer groups. Now, the same individual may be crossing some of those things at different points in their life, but I do think we've got to think about them as distinct groups, and how we bring them all together to kind of help serve the patient is the right way to do it. So, but I think that what's relevant is very different across customer groups, in my opinion, right? So, and then to Joanne's point, yeah, I completely agree. I think, being responsible, like I was talking about before, but also just making sure we're being conscious of the elements that Joanne talked about around diversity and inclusion is critically important. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things to discuss on that front, which is probably another whole call. But yeah, to answer your question directly, absolutely. I think it's three distinct customer groups at a minimum.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your insights on our new omni-channel world, which isn't so new, but evolving as we continue to look at the role that data and analytics and our personalized messages need to take in the form of reaching our customers in context. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.